I'm a brilliant intellectual.
As am I.
The two of us are sick of dealing with troglodytes, and so we moved into a bomb shelter so we wouldn't catch the stupid.
Now we pass our intelligence on by debunking YouTube videos.
We are
The Debunkers.
In the past few years, many Republican governors have signed legislation targeting LGBTQ people into law.
Oh my, really?
Two controversial bills are now law in Alabama.
A bill regulating what school bathroom Oklahoma students use.
A House committee passed a bill focused on pronouns.
And hundreds more of these bills have been introduced in state legislatures. More every year for the last 3 years.
And what do these laws say?
The laws are increasingly focused on what sports teams transgender school children can play on.
That boys can't beat girls senseless in female athletic programs.
Which bathroom they can use.
That girls are safe in their own bathrooms.
And about the use of pronouns.
And you can't force people to use imaginary new words.
But these bills are at the state level. If you look to the federal government, you'd hear a different message to transgender students.
We're here to say that's wrong and it's against the law.
That's because the current federal government believes gender identity discrimination violates a 1972 federal civil rights law. So when it comes to the rights of trans students, conservative states and the federal government are at odds.
And?
But the enforcers of education policy are a third level of government, local school boards, and they are caught in between, with extraordinarily high stakes.
I was thinking, wow, there's no way I'm ever gonna vote yes for this.
Gender affirmation is suicide prevention.
Exactly. If you affirm a child's actual gender instead of transing them, they'll have a lower suicide rate over the course of their life.
This coming year will be my 7th year teaching in Tennessee. I'm seeing a lot more depression, a lot more anxiety. I'm seeing a lot of suicidal ideation, which the data bears out.
One estimate says that 20% of trans and non-binary youth will attempt suicide. That's 2 times the rate of their cisgendered peers.
This estimate comes from the Trevor Project, though not from the source they provide in the description. They cite this, but the actual study is this.
Wow, they're even wrong about being wrong.
Firstly, the Trevor Project has conducted this survey since 2019. Their stats show a decline in attempted suicide for trans kids, despite the increase in AnTi-TrANS legislation.
Also, it should be noted that the Trevor Project's data here targets kids who are using social media, which Jonathan Haidt's research has shown is a major cause of the mental illness epidemic in teen girls, and correlated with higher rates of depression in both sexes.
So the Trevor Project is targeting people who are already more susceptible to depression.
We should also note that this conveniently neglects to mention this data was collected throughout the COVID lockdowns, which caused teen suicidal ideation to skyrocket.
All this to say, there's no strong evidence to support the view that affirmation lessens suicide rates. And speaking of other questionable ways that the Trevor Project targets teens, here's an online ad where they encourage minors to have secret sexual conversations with them and advertise that they can click a button to hide all of the info from their parents.
And other surveys on mental health and trans youth find that they are more than twice as likely as cisgender children to experience bullying, or to not attend school because they didn't feel safe.
Yes, bullying is bad, and that child being bullied is the fault of the bullies doing it and the parents for not stepping in. But don't expect me to believe that the activists crafting this nonsense give a single shit about a child being bullied when they're okay with that child being sterilized and having their genitals mutilated, when they're okay with young men savagely beating girls in women's contact sports, and think that every child who's sexually abused in a single-sex bathroom by a transgender pervert is a worthwhile sacrifice to make it the altar of their bull gender ideology.
I do have a transgender son that is 17 years old. I live in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
Almost nowhere have more anti-LGBTQ bills been introduced this year than in Tennessee, and at least 2 anti-trans laws related to participation in school sports and bathrooms have already gone into effect.
Good!
Tennessee's bathroom law allows students, parents, or teachers to sue schools if they allow a transgender student in the bathroom of their gender identity when others are in there.
In our school, the rule is trans kids either have to use the restroom designated for their sex assigned at birth, or they need to go find a single stall, gender neutral restroom. And our campuses were not built that way.
From one end of the school to the other, upstairs on this end to downstairs on that. The one time that Toby decided to just go ahead and go into the male facilities, they started chanting, they started beating on the stall door.
You're asking a kid to fight through dysphoria and to put themselves in harm's way.
Bullying is wrong, but you know what else is wrong? Mutilating a child's genitals and rendering them infertile for the rest of their lives, encouraging a teen to embrace gender confusion at the most vulnerable time in their life, increasing their risk of suicide, drug abuse, and even bullying, all of them resulting in them living an empty, confused life so you can go on and feel good about yourself for supporting the current trendy social cause. The expense of a young person's life.
Not to mention this characterization is entirely disingenuous. First of all, Tennessee House Bill 1233 states that a Tennessee state school must have reasonable accommodations for people who write in asking to use other bathrooms.
This video portrays the scenario as there only being one bathroom available, on a different floor and located as far away as possible.
The reality is, in this situation, the school administration had granted Toby permission to use any and all faculty bathrooms.
On that particular day and time, Toby had to use the restroom. All faculty bathrooms were locked.
Toby then proceeded to use the boys' bathroom, where she got harassed by a group of guys who walked in and started banging on the stall.
So the real story here is about a group of teenage boys who decided to be jerks one day, not about a lack of accommodation. The law clearly provides for reasonable accommodation, and Toby was more than reasonably accommodated for by the administration. It was an unfortunate series of circumstances that led to this situation.
It was shameful for these boys to bully a young gender-confused girl. Men are supposed to protect women. But you know what's worse? Way worse. People who cut off their breasts for money. People who chemically castrate minors. People who groom children. And using this girl being bullied as a shield from criticism when you're butchering children is as transparent as it is vile.
In 2021, when the Tennessee laws went into effect, most school boards adopted it as policy. But not all of them.
We are being asked to pass a policy that goes along with state law, yet is a violation of civil rights.
This is the Metro Nashville Public School Board, which governs the school district of roughly 80,000 students, discussing whether or not to adopt the state law that bans transgender athletes from participating in girls' sports in public middle and high schools.
Interestingly enough, other than a fleeting reference at 723, this is the last mention of transgender people competing in opposite-sex sports. Now, why could that be?
Most likely because even they couldn't spit enough bull to even attempt to refute the evidence that biological men have a distinct advantage over women. And getting people to think about why we would ever want to segregate such activities on the basis of biological sex in the first place leads people down some interesting rabbit holes.
For example, even if trans women represented around 0.6% of the population, then they seem overrepresented in winner's circles. Here's a list of 29 sports in which trans women are now competing and winning.
The best 400-meter sprint time for U.S. runner Allison Felix, the fastest female sprinter in the world, is 49.26 seconds.
According to 2018 data, nearly 300 high school boys in the U.S. alone could beat Felix's world record.
The world record for fastest pitch by a female player is 83 miles an hour.
Which doesn't even reach the low average for male college baseball pitchers, which is somewhere between 87 and 95 miles per hour.
We could go on, but we likely don't need to, because if you're willfully stupid enough to believe men don't have an edge when playing sports with women, you aren't capable of convincing or worthy of our time.
But if you were interested in learning more, you could check out Ground News!
Ground News is the world's first news comparison platform. It allows you to sort through different news stories and see how the left is reporting on things as opposed to the right, making you a fact-checking whiz!
You'll definitely want to check out the Blind Spot feature. It's an extremely useful tool that shows you specific stories that have gone underreported by the left or right.
Like this story, about how Bud Light sales have dropped again, which no one on the left is discussing.
If you scroll down a little further, you can see each of the news outlets that have reported on the story, as well as each of the sources' headlines and their political bias rating.
That's right. To get 30% off a Vantage subscription, go to ground.news/freedomtunes. That's ground.news/freedomtunes.
TOONS. Ground.news/freedomtunes.
Now back to the show.
It is a moral and ethical dilemma for me as a board member.
Whether to let boys compete in girls' sports?
It was not something that anyone on our board was willing to make the motion to pass.
The focus has just been wrong. Like, how is this something that we're placing at the feet of our children?
All those in favor of deferring policy 4.301, raise your hand. Okay. It's unanimous.
We're in this place now where we as a district have been able to say there are adults and people in charge in your life who support you and care about you.
Who want to encourage you to make horrible decisions that will irreversibly lower your quality of life because they're too cowardly to protect you, when protecting you means telling you something you don't want to hear.
And so the thought that our hand may be forced to implement these anti-trans policies is very scary to me.
The thought of fewer girls being raped in bathrooms or being systemically encouraged to remove their breasts frightens you?
But that decision is in a legal gray zone, and it could have consequences. School boards, states, and the federal government all play a role in U.S. education policy. But states in particular have the most power over public schools within their borders.
This is the part where you make a transparent argument for why communities should have no say in whether gender-bending perversion is forced onto their children, and that the monolithic federal government needs to force your disgusting confusion onto them, correct?
That's because public education in this country is traditionally funded by property taxes, which are not federal in nature, but they're state and local based.
Ew, that gives community members who are paying for the education the ability to comment on it. Yuck.
School boards can set their own policy, but when states pass laws related to public schools, they are obligated to adopt them. If they don't, they risk
funding, all the way. That's a threat that hangs over our heads pretty consistently, and I mean we can't function without that funding.
Oh no, state taxpayers also get to have a say with respect to how state funding is allocated?
Listen closely to what they're about to say. It might seem like they're taking it in the opposite direction, but they aren't. They're going to make the argument that it's an overstep for state government to withdraw funds from schools if they don't like what the money is going towards, and use that to argue for an actual government overstep when the federal government flat out forces their policies onto these schools, rather than simply refusing to pay for something that they think is evil.
Typically, the vast majority of public school funding comes from state and local governments, but a small portion does come from the federal government, mostly through programs related to equity, like for students with disabilities and for students living in poverty.
These kinds of resources augment what's available from state and local funds.
Even though this slice is small, any school that receives federal financial assistance is beholden to Title IX, the 1972 civil rights law that, for 50 years, has ensured that there is no discrimination on the basis of sex. And for public schools, the federal agencies that enforce Title IX compliance are tied to whoever is in the White House. And the past 3 administrations have differed in their interpretation of Title IX. The Obama administration ruled that it protects LGBTQ students, but the Trump administration reversed it, and the Biden administration restored it again. That's why today, in 2022, it's a violation of federal civil rights law to discriminate against LGBTQ students in public schools, which could make a school district liable to a federal investigation, while some states, who control most school funding, have passed laws contrary to that.
Wrong. They're actually required to discriminate in favor of them. Every other student has to compete in a sports team or use a bathroom based on their sex assigned at birth. Transgender students get the special privilege of being able to use whatever bathroom they want.
Also, notice what's happening here. In this segment between 33 and 59 seconds, and this segment here between 5 minutes 27 seconds and 6 minutes and 18 seconds.
The 1972 federal civil rights law they cite in the first section is Title IX, which states no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance.
There are 2 important things to note here. 1, the definition of sex, and 2, the fact that it's limited to education programs which receive federal financial assistance.
The executive branch's interpretation of Title IX only regards the definition of sex, i.e. whether that word includes gender or not. It has nothing to do with sexual orientation, which is already fully protected. So the Trump administration didn't reverse any protections for LGBTQ students. Regardless of how the federal government interprets Title IX, LGBTQ students will always be protected. This is literally just a question of the extent to which the government can or can't, much less whether it chooses to, punish schools for upholding the scientific tenets of biology or actively subverting them.
The opening line of this video, in the past few years, many Republican governors have signed legislation targeting LGBTQ people into law, is an intentional framing. LGBTQ people aren't under threat. Trans activists who deny both science and reason are.
So school districts have to figure out what to do, and so do the families of trans students.
I would say it puts us in limbo, because while we feel heard and appreciated by maybe local boards, the state is still saying that they're not welcome.
As we saw earlier, it is Tennessee state law for public schools to make reasonable accommodations for transgender students. So what do these people want? When will it ever be enough?
So what do? It makes all of us want to move.
No, don't do that.
I get a little fuzzy about some of it because the federal law says that you cannot do this. That supersedes the state laws, but yet they still do it, and then they cite Governor Lee's bills as a reason to discriminate.
In states like Tennessee, this legal limbo could eventually be solved by a lawsuit or federal civil rights investigation that could overturn a state law. There is already a federal lawsuit on behalf of a trans teen boy in Tennessee suing to play on the boys' golf team. And there's a federal lawsuit over Tennessee's bathroom law. But those won't necessarily change things outside of Tennessee. The institution with the power to do that nationally and that could force harmony with federal, state, and local policy would be the Supreme Court. But if those rulings don't come out in favor of trans students, the last line of defense will continue to be those closest to them.
Grooming them to be trans, yeah.
Teachers are going to be a big part of saving kids' lives, depending on just how willing they are to be supportive, to be affirming. School has always been that one place where we can hopefully find somebody who will love us and value us for who we are.
An adult who is convincing children to experiment with their sexual identity, also seeming to have those children convinced that they're the only adult who loves and values them. Now, what's that called?
If only there were a word for it.